Hi there, I'm your host, John Ivison, for our trek through the trials and tribulations of a week in Canadian politics. As usual, I'm joined by Marcella Munro, who is the owner-operator of WPM Public Affairs, and Andrew Balfour, who is the managing partner of Rubicon Strategies. Welcome both. It's been a sombre week with the discovery of the unmarked graves of 215 children at a former residential school in Kamloops, BC. Strictly speaking, it was not a discovery because the local Indigenous community leaders knew there was an internment site there. It was the use of ground-penetrating radar that allowed them to specify the number of bodies. The story has proven to be explosive, and I think the nation is being gripped by grief and anger, fingers pointed at the federal government for not funding the discovery of more of these sites, as they had promised to do in various budgets and as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Fingers pointed even more so at the churches who ran these schools and the politicians who founded them, sponsored them, not least Sir John A. Macdonald, one of the fathers of Confederation. Marcella, you worked in Alberta where many of these residential schools were sited. What do you think it is about this story that's caused such soul searching this week?
I mean, I'm still grappling with it myself. The first week I was in Premier Notley's office in Calgary, I was visited by Chief Crowshoe, and he told me this horrible story about not just residential schools, but the fact that the people who were taking these kids into residential schools, they were bargaining with the families and saying, like, if you bring us your most treasured things, like basically they were trying to force these parents to bring them their prayer beads, their whatever they had, these indigenous symbols of their society as trade for visiting their children. And I couldn't believe, I cried during the meeting. I cried writing the report for the Premier. Like, it was basically like we were, at that point, the government of Alberta was empowering people to ask these families to trade their most ceremonial objects to talk to their kids. And that was, for me, and that was in 2015, that was the time when I finally went like I knew about the horrible stories, but it didn't really hit me until I heard someone tell me to my face, like, this is what they did, and can you help me figure this out? And so
I think that's part of it. Nobody read the Truth and Reconciliation report when it came out. The summary is 500 pages. I read it this week, and I remember reading it at the time. It's horrifying. I was in tears reading it. It's really bad. I think the only, if there is any kind of upside to this week, which, you know, we have a lot of work to do, but at least Canadians are being dead on confronted with, this is what happened, right? Like, when you think about a child that you love, like, I'm not even a parent, but I love children. I've got lots of children I love. If you think about a child being put in that situation, then think about that child, like, dying alone with, like, no one around them, and then being buried anonymously, and their parents never knowing what happened to them. Like, that, I think, is just a painful picture for anyone to confront. I mean, often they may have known. The report's clear that quite often the parents will be told, but the bodies were never sent back to the parents because to do so would have been at the parents' expense, and often they couldn't pay for the expense.
And there's such a history of, like, you've got to remember too, this was a time of tuberculosis, this was a time of the flu, right? So there was just a lot of viral
and the
death.
Schools were incubators for those things. I mean, they were poorly ventilated, the kids were malnourished, quite often abused. Some people might have had positive experiences, but the bottom line was this system was designed to eliminate the Indian in these children. And the TRC called it cultural genocide, and I think it's a fitting label for what it was. But Andrew, moving on, so Jason Kenney's in trouble again, and not because he had dinner with his cabinet on the roof of the Sky Palace. which
no government leader should ever be on the Sky Palace in public. Like it's
bad history for various Alberta leaders. But he wrote something, and it appeared in the National Post this week, that defended Canada's founding fathers as imperfect but worthy of celebration because of the great historic achievement that is Canada. He warned that if Sir John A is cancelled, then so will Wilfrid Laurier, who perpetuated the residential schools. So will Pierre Trudeau, for that matter, whose white paper in 1969 was also called for assimilation. Is it time for a reckoning on these historical figures?
Through the lens of what you're saying around Premier Kenney, one has to look at it, the politics of it. A core constituency of his voter are the people who are angry about the fact that we are canceling these things. So he's coming out and saying that. Whether you agree or disagree, he makes a point, things were different. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but you can't take the politics out of any of these things. He is doing this. I guarantee you that many voters in rural Alberta and many people across Canada were silently, and maybe not so silently, in vehement agreement with him on what he was saying. I mean, perhaps when you're in the position that he's in right now and you're already under fire, it might have been a good time to turtle and not say anything and have been like politically correct and just skated out of it instead of doubling down. But he decided to double down, and I guarantee you that there's a bunch of people who are now more on side with Jason Kenney than they were before, and he's facing this potential revolt in his caucus, which is coming from the far right, and this would appease those people.
On the substantive issue, which the last 24 hours has taught me that the place not to hold that nuanced debate on the nation's future is Twitter, which I was foolish enough to do. But I think there needs to be a framework to look at these specific cases, and fortunately for us, Yale University has provided that framework when they were looking at renaming Calhoun College, which was named after a proponent of slavery. And a committee there suggested that renaming on the basis of values is sometimes valid if certain principles are met. And those principles, namely, are the namesake's legacy, what is his or her principal legacy, and whether his or her views were exceptional at the time. And from MacDonald's point of view, I think it's fair to say that his views were not exceptional at the time. In fact, he was in favour of adult male suffrage for First Nations, while I think it was Oliver Mowat, who was the Liberal leader, argued that First Nations had no legal title to land at all. So, I mean, these are debates that reasonable people can have, I think. And, you know, timing is maybe an issue. I mean, obviously things are raw, but this is very core. I mean, Marcella, you're shaking your head. You don't agree with that? This seems to me to be
I think this is
core to the
preposterous nonsense. Let me tell you a few reasons why. One, name me one statue of a female leader that you're thinking about. There isn't one. Excuse me.
What are you talking about? There's the one right out my door here, the famous.
And the famous five.
Name me one statue of a female leader that you're thinking that we need to, like, we're talking about a very specific group of people is what I'm trying to say, right? And so...
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is a global debate now about anybody involved with slavery, anybody involved in Canada with First Nations
Okay, but
policy.
the other thing is that, like, if you listen to some of the historians talking about this, I'm thinking now about Tom Holland from the UK, you know, this is a thousands of years discussion, right? It's not like statues of leaders are up for a million years. There's often been times in history where you go, this is not going to stand. We can think about ancient Egypt. You can talk about the Romans. Like, we don't get to just put a statue somewhere and go like, this person is forever. We're indebted to them. It's not true.
No, but we're not
right?
talking about ancient Greece. We're talking about Canada in the last 150 years.
Right. And so my point being, like, history changes, and as history changes and as the conversation around what our country is and how we are going to move evolves, you have to rethink these things. And they are symbolic for sure. I don't think this is the right moment for this discussion, to be honest, but I also think as we can learn from listening to the Treaty 6 elder who was talking this week in Alberta, this conversation is kind of a sideshow, right? And so for Jason Kenney, for instance, to be raising this issue of cancel culture right now when they're talking about McDonald is not really the point. The point is, how are we going to help these people? How are we going to help the people that were affected by it? And I could care less, honestly, whether a statue stays or doesn't stay. That's not, to me, what's going to help these people. And if people want to talk about that, if the people who are affected, if their communities want to talk about that, then we should engage that discussion. But we can't just, as, my family, on my grandmother's side, we came here in the 1830s. They were basically sent by the British government to help colonize North America. Like, I have been honestly thinking about that a lot this week. Like, what did that mean? What did that look like? Like, we have to revisit that. You can't just shut it down and be like, John A. Macdonald was the best. Like, whatever. He can have a statue or not.
I'm not advocating that. I'm saying that we should have a framework to discuss these issues rationally.
There's no framework
and
when your community has been attacked with this kind of genocidal, like, we're going to get rid of you. Like, what's the framework, John? Tell me. I'd love to hear it.
I'm saying that there should be a discussion about McDonald's legacy, Laurier's legacy, the Famous Five legacy. Famous Five were held opinions about eugenics, as did Tommy Douglas, the leader of the party you support.
Sure, fine. So you just said you read the Truth and Reconciliation report. Read what John A. Macdonald said about this issue.
I
right?
did, and I think that
understand
any
the
discussion.
pain.
Any discussion that would be had on this subject, you can't sanitize that.
You cannot. And that's not I've been reading the letters of my great ancestor, Catherine Parr Traill, and she talks about how Indigenous people were being starved to death, right? In her letters.
And
there are people in that time frame who understood that we were doing this.
But McDonald's views were not exceptional. Anyway, I think we could be here. We could be here, but at least we're having a rational debate about it. I mean, I think that this has caused such raw feelings that we should be talking about these issues. But let's move on to more mundane matters.
John, can I just point out one quick thing? So, what I'm doing during this conversation is what most white men of privilege should be doing.
Well, I don't think shutting up is the right idea, but I think listening. I remember reading Salman Rushdie talking about the Me Too movement, and he said this is a time for listening, and I think that this may be a time for listening. But let's move on because our time is limited, and we've got to look at other issues, and one of them is that Justin Trudeau, I'm sure he's delighted about this, is getting out the hell out of the country. He's going to Cornwall for the G7. Where he will meet Joe Biden for the first time in person since Biden was elected. And Trudeau is apparently going to raise the issues of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who are still incarcerated in China and have been so for more than 900 days. The principal Canadian strategy seems to be to keep lobbying Biden in the hope that he will bring up the issue with President Xi Jinping and thereby magically release the two Michaels, which seems to me to be the definition of a Hail Mary, long odds with very little chance of completion. Is it time for something different, Marcella?
I honestly don't know what the government can do at this point, right? Like, they have, in my view, been quite tepid on trying to get these two individuals released who, through no fault of their own, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, essentially, is what happened, right? And I don't know what the game plan has been. It's been very kind of opaque over the course of the last, almost 2 years now. So I think whatever card they can pull out, they should pull it out, because this is crazy nonsense.
Well, there is something that they can do, and it's fully within the jurisdiction of the Minister of Justice to intervene at any time and release Meng Wanzhou. And, the Michaels' fortunes are inexorably tied to the extradition request by the US to send her to the US on charges of fraud. I spoke to her legal team this week, and she goes before a judge again in June. The judge from the British Columbia Supreme Court will find whether there's substantive issues against her, whether the US has followed international law. The matter, however she resolves, the matter then goes to the minister to review. In either of those phases, the Meng can appeal, so that we go to another court, and ultimately she can go to the Supreme Court of Canada. It left me with the feeling that she is going to win. She's either going to win in the British Columbia Supreme Court, in the Court of Appeal, or in the Supreme Court of Canada. And if she wins at any stage, Canada loses any leverage to get the Michaels out. Andrew, do you think Lametti should step in and just say, this thing's gone far enough, the case is thin, let her go, let's get the Michaels out?
Well, that certainly is an option. I don't really understand, and this is making things much more simpler than they are, but I don't understand why, instead of asking Biden to carry our water for us, why don't we just ask him to allow us to release her and do it a change, a 1 for 2? Hey, we'll give you this lady back, you guys give us these 2 guys back. Let's all walk away and water under the bridge. Let's keep all of these dip relations going. Like under the Trump regime, that didn't seem like a thing, and he seemed to be fairly combative about it. But maybe Biden just wants to
apparently
help us
the Department
end
of Justice in the U.S. does not want to do any kind of deal on a deferred prosecution agreement where if she admitted guilt they might let her go. Apparently they don't want to do that, and apparently Meng claims to be innocent, so there's nothing she can plead guilty to.
No, but what about just doing the swap? Just end it for everyone. Make it so no one ever let's get these 2 Canadians home. Let's get her from her 6,000 square foot mansion in Vancouver to a 10,000 square foot mansion in Beijing.
I agree with Andrew on this. I don't feel like what is the sauce we're trying to get out of this nugget at this point, right? I think the point was made. I think, now we've got China very angry with us, and we've got the U.S. I don't know what they're going to do that's so magical. I think the simple solution in this case probably is the best, where you just say, you know what, we're kind of sick of this, and so have your daughter back, Mr.
I gather some member of the cabinet are getting sick of it as well and impatient. But the Prime Minister seems to be the stumbling block because he has a no ransom policy. We saw this in the when Filipino jihadists captured 2 Canadians and they ended up getting beheaded. Now Canada has played ball with in hostage diplomacy many times before, but apparently is not willing to do so under the Trudeau regime, which may be the problem. But let's move on. We're running out of time, and we're talking about Trudeau going to Cornwall. He obviously then has to come back from Cornwall. And Andrew, the big question is, will he go and stay in one of his own quarantine hotels?
I think that even if before, we've seen this recommendation that suggests that the quarantine hotels have been ineffective and they need to stop, and et cetera, but even if prior to him returning from this trip, they are canceled or however it goes, he kind of just has to go and do it. The thing that a lot of people have misunderstood around the quarantine hotel is you actually don't have to stay there for 3 days. You just have to stay until you get a test. He's the Prime Minister of Canada. He could probably get a test result pretty fast. He could probably just go check into the Holiday Inn Express, have a bad meal or 2, and then be able to check out, go back to Rideau Cottage and chill with his family for 13 days.
I would love to see him in the Holiday Inn Express in Toronto. It's the only hotel where you would ask for a room without a view.
Well, realistically, if I had to go and fly in and be in a quarantine hotel anywhere, I'd ask that the plane go to Vancouver,
Fairmont is
because at least
awesome,
then you can stay at a Fairmont.
Back in the day, love
back in the day, and soon to be revisited, though, right? You're going to head back there soon.
Please. Yeah.
Just finally, then, the borders reopening. I mean, there is a lot of pressure for the borders to reopen, even within the Liberal caucus. They were Wayne Easter and Nate Erskine-Smith signed up with a US congressman to call for the border to be reopened this week. It would appear to be, well, I'm hearing that they're not going to do it on June 22nd when the current one runs out, so it may be another month. Is it dependent on vaccination levels, do you think? And I mean, how far are we from 75-20?
It's 75-20. I think that there's no way, like the government's been pretty clear that this is the magic number, so they look pretty foolish. And, you know, there's many people out there who don't seem to understand that these is renewed on the 22nd of every month, and like people are like, oh, the Americans are like, oh, 4th of July, and there's all these other dates. Well, it's the
Calgary Stampede.
Well, that's still just the dumbest thing ever,
But our limits, our levels, Marcella, at the moment are 58.6. 58% have had first jab.
It's been very
6%
fast in Canada, though, John, and I think we know that, right? Like it's, excuse me, been a fast ramp up, and I feel like the Canadian appetite for getting their second dose is probably pretty high. So to me, it's like, can we get the second doses into people fast enough? I also think like there's a lot of border envy going on right now. Right? Because we're watching from afar as our southern neighbors start to enjoy their lives again in a more normal way. They're not even as vaccinated as us. So I think a lot of Canadians are you're going to have to, I think, hit the sweet spot in terms of public intake on this, where they are like willing to take the second dose just to get to that, because I feel like they're looking at the US and going like, well, lots of those people don't have the second dose and they're in Vegas, like going to a Britney Spears concert. I guess Britney's not on stage yet, but you know what I'm saying, like Cher or whatever.
I think the issue with that, and I think that this is where the let's call them the dumb people in our society, because I can't use the word that I wanted to. But like, once all these people, you know, you look at the province of Alberta as an example, like in the last week, 5% of all vaccine appointments have been no-shows. Once all these people realize that they're never going to be allowed to leave the country again, they're going to be willing to like take that needle in any part of their body. Like,
well, with that vivid image, we better wind up. Thank you, guys. A much more respectful debate than I had on Twitter yesterday, and we can agree to disagree, Marcella.
You bet.
See you next week, folks.
Thanks.